So we are in chapter 5, which is Earth's environmental systems and ecosystem ecology. And this lesson is all about Earth's environmental systems. So we start by defining a system, which in your book is a network of relationships among parts that influence each other through the exchange of energy, matter, or information. So it's a set of things that interact with each other and influence each other, and we're going to be exchanging energy, matter, or information. So the central case is about the Chesapeake Bay, so make sure that you read that. That way you understand all these things we're talking about. So the Chesapeake Bay is an example of a system, and it receives inputs of fresh water, sediments, nutrients, and pollution from its watershed. Its watershed is where all the water comes from, so any precipitation that flows or comes up from the ground then flows into the Chesapeake Bay. That's what a watershed is. And the fishermen that harvest in the Chesapeake Bay, they harvest some of the bay's output. So the input is all of that freshwater, sediment, nutrients, and pollution, and the output is matter and energy in the form of seafood. So systems are really intricate, and we have what's called a feedback loop. And so this can be when an output will also serve as an input. So whatever's coming out is coming back in. And this is called a feedback loop. There's two kinds of feedback loops. A negative feedback loop is the majority of what we'll see in nature, is when the output acts as an input and causes the system to work in the other direction. So it's negative because the system is moving one way and then it will switch back and go the other way. So that's why it's called a negative feedback loop. It doesn't mean that it's a bad thing at all, and we'll talk about that. So it says it results when the system moving in one direction acts as an input that causes the system to move back in the other direction. So for example, the way that your body regulates temperature is the best example of negative feedback, because so here's your brain. Let's say that you start to get, your input says too hot. So what your brain says to do is seek shade, get out of the sun, get out of the heat, and sweat. So your brain will tell you, you will decide to move, and your body will start to sweat. That's the output. Input too hot, output sweat, get out of the sun. So then the outcome of that, the output is that your body cools down. But now if you go too much, suddenly you're in the shade and the temperature drops, or you sweat too much and it's breezy, your body cools down and now you might be too cold. So the output is now acting as an input in that you're too cold. Your brain processes that, says, oh, I'm too cold, I need to put on a sweater, or I need to shiver in order to raise my body temperature to warm. Then you might get to be too warm, and then suddenly you're too hot again. This happens a lot, especially around this time of year, where it's this time of year being fall, where it's chilly in the morning and warm in the afternoon, putting on a sweater, taking off a sweater, putting on a sweater, etc. That's negative feedback. It regulates, when you get too hot, it cools it down. When you get too cold, it warms it back up. This is different than a positive feedback loop when the output causes the system to keep going in the way it was going. So the melting of glaciers and sea ice in the Arctic is an example. So as heat warms the surface, it causes further melting, right? So in a cool climate, sunlight reflects off a white surface. So the top layer is going to melt. But as the climate warms, the Earth, where there's these gaps in the ice, is going to absorb the heat, which means that now the ice is going to melt even more. So the way that it works is there's a little bit of ice melting, but as the ice melts, it causes even more ice melting. So it just keeps going and going and going until eventually we would melt all of the ice. So that would be a positive feedback loop. Okay, so there's several defining properties of a system. So if a system operates through negative feedback, then it will eventually arrive at this place called dynamic equilibrium. Equilibrium meaning a steady state, but dynamic means that it is moving. And so this is where we stay around one level. So again, our body temperature is a good example of this. We're always around 98.6. We might go up a little bit, we might drop a little bit, but we're maintaining around that. And that's what will lead to what's called homeostasis, which is the tendency of a system to maintain stable internal conditions. All living things maintain homeostasis. It's one of the requirements of life. So for example, we regulate our water levels, we regulate our body temperature, all of that. So that's one. If you're a negative feedback system, then you will work around dynamic equilibrium to maintain homeostasis. Another characteristic is something that there's these properties that appear when you put a bunch of things together that are not there in the individual parts. Those are called emergent properties. So properties that emerge as a system goes together. So for example, if you study the cell, if you're looking at a tree and you study the cell and tissue organization of a tree, so what are the cells that make up the different parts of it? Here I have cork cells, here I have leaf cells, here I have stem cells, whatever it might be. Those all have their properties, but it's not until you put them together that you can understand the importance of a tree and a habitat, because now the tree is now a place to live. It's a place, it's a mating center. It's providing, as the leaves die, it's providing nutrients for the soil. So it's now a part of a bigger piece, which the individual cells would not be. another example would be any electronic. You take it apart and it doesn't, those pieces don't do much by themselves, right? Like for example, my AirPods. If I took this apart, I would have the pieces of the case. By themselves, they're hard white plastic, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Same thing with this, take it apart. Each piece would look different. It's not until they're all together that they function in their job. So that's what an emergent property is. So systems have emergent properties. And I'm sure you could have predicted this, but environmental systems interact, meaning the systems are not isolated. So systems are going to be exchanging energy, matter, and information with other systems. And how a system is defined is going to be dependent on what you're studying. So for example, if you're a science studying runoff, back to the central case, runoff is precipitation that flows over land and into waterways. So precipitation is falling from the sky, it's moving across land and eventually ending up in a waterway. That's called runoff. So if you're studying runoff, your Chesapeake Bay would be a system. All the water flowing into the Chesapeake Bay and the actual bay itself would be the system. If you were studying the rock cycle, it might be something else in the same area, but since we're studying one thing at a time, we can define systems in different ways. Okay, so then to understand the dead zones in the Chesapeake Bay, again, make sure you read that beginning part, we have to include both the watershed and the airshed. So the watershed, by definition, is the precipitation and the land area it covers to get to a waterway. So all around here, all of this land is providing water to the Chesapeake Bay, okay? From ground sources, from precipitation, it all will eventually end up here. That's the watershed. The airshed is the geographic area that produces pollutants that are likely to end up in a waterway. So we're thinking now the atmosphere that's interacting with the watershed, that's the airshed. So in 2015, in a recent study, the majority of the nitrogen and phosphorus nutrient pollution, so the nutrient pollution that's getting into the Chesapeake Bay, meaning nutrients that are at too high of a level causing pollution, came from agriculture. So for example, over here, this is the nitrogen entering the Chesapeake Bay. It was 32% of the nutrient pollution came from agriculture. Phosphorus was 45%, and another third came from atmospheric sources. So this is an atmospheric source of nitrogen. Okay, so this is a problem. The nutrient pollution causes what will eventually lead to what's called eutrophication or a dead zone. So basically, we have all this extra nutrients and it gets into the water, and now all the phytoplankton, it's basically the algae, the single-celled algae that live on the top of the ocean, now they have this huge food source because now there's all this nitrogen and phosphorus. It's like a feast for them. So they eat like crazy, they replicate like crazy. Their food would have been a limiting factor before and now it's not, so their carrying capacity increases. There's a ton, an overpopulation of phytoplankton. But then they run out of food and they die and they fall to the bottom of the ocean. Now there's an influx of dead phytoplankton and their waste, so the bacteria and decomposers that live on the bottom, now they have a crazy increase in food and they are happy as can be, they flourish, and now we have a microbial bloom, okay? And then what happens is the microbes that live down there, they use oxygen to eat and they suck all of the oxygen out of the water because they are blooming and they're just eating it all. So now there's no more oxygen. What happens is all of the living things that live down there that aren't the microbes, all the plants, all the fish, all the oysters, all the fish and shrimp, they all die because there's no more oxygen, and that's what's called a dead zone. So you would think that an influx of fertilizer would be a good thing, but it actually leads to what's called a dead zone. It's called hypoxic because it's low in oxygen. It's a dead zone. And this overall process is called eutrophication. So too much nitrogen and phosphorus, algal bloom where the phytoplankton flourish and bloom, then they die and then the bacteria eat them, so they bloom and they take all the oxygen out of the water and then we get to a dead zone. Okay, and then the last part of this section is that the different ways we can look at Earth systems. Remember that we can classify a system based on what we're studying. So the lithosphere, we talked about when we talked about the layers of the Earth, and it was a little bit confusing because it maintains the mantle and the crust. That's because those two things really interact, like we learned about with the plate tectonics. So we call that the lithosphere because we can look at that as a system, the upper mantle and the crust and the rock and sediment that's in there. Another system, another sphere we could look at would be the atmosphere. It's all the air surrounding the planet. Talk about the hydrosphere, which is all the surface water, the underground water, and the atmospheric water. So all the water on the planet and how it interacts with each other. And lastly, we can talk about the biosphere, which is the planet's organisms and all of the abiotic factors, so all of the ecosystems together. And we need to be able to understand all of these to understand ecology. And that's the end of this lesson.